welcome everyone. I'm Craig Rayborn. I'm the Executive Director here at Compass, and I'm really happy to welcome everyone to tonight's education program called Designing for Human Nature, How Psychology Can Improve Transportation Safety with Dr. Ben Barton from University of Idaho. So as a brief description of what we'll be hearing about tonight, just know that transportation systems are designed for people, and considerations such as human perception, attention, and error are really important to include in the design and planning process. So tonight, Dr. Barton will share how understanding these human behaviors can help planners, engineers, and community leaders create transportation systems that better anticipate human limitations and therefore result in safer outcomes for everyone. So Dr. Benjamin Barton is a professor and chair of the psychology department, or the psychology and communication department at the University of Idaho, where he manages the psychology, communication, and organizational science programs in addition to his fun duties as a department chair. Dr. Barton teaches courses in a variety of human developmental topics, human factors design, and research methods. His research primarily focuses on causes and preventions of unintentional injuries, including injuries sustained on transportation systems. You can find his full bio on the table by the door. Some housekeeping items before we turn it over. Just remember, as we've been telling everyone as you come in, we've got some soft drinks and refreshments at the back by the door. The restrooms are out the back to the right and on your right. If you did not sign in, and I think everyone did, but if you did not, please do so before you leave. We've got the sign-in forms on the table at the back. We also have evaluation forms on your tables, and so we'd really appreciate if you fill one of those out and leave it in the basket on the table by the door. We are recording tonight's presentation, and we'll share it later on Compass's YouTube channel, and we'll also share tonight's slides on the Compass website. So, with that, please silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Dr. Ben Barton.
Wish my students would do that. Well, thanks for having me down and giving me a chance to talk to all of you about this important topic. I noticed on the sheets on the tables that there's a question about whether you met your objectives or you had anything you were interested in. And of course, I don't know quite what everyone came into the room with on their mind and what they're hoping to get out of it, so feel free to raise your hand at any point during the presentation and ask if something seems to be hitting a point you're really interested in, or if there's something not up here that you're interested in talking about. I kind of wanted to approach this topic from the perspective of what I do in my research and also human factors psychology. So first I want to give you an overview of kind of what we do in my laboratory, so you'll have an understanding of what I do and my mindset coming out of this. I am, of course, professor and chair of the university. I've been chair of the Department of Psychology and Communication for almost 8 years. And we also have, in addition to those 3 programs that you heard about, we have a Human Factors Master's Program and an Experimental Psychology PhD program. All of our students in those programs are studying things that are related to what we're going to talk about in some way. My laboratory at the university is called Police Injury Research Laboratory. If you've had any psychology training, perhaps you might have picked it up in Psych 101, you'll recognize the person with the rod through his head there. Anyone remember that from Psych 101?
Can't remember his name.
Phineas Gage is his name. It's presented in psychology as an example of a case study which helped us learn the importance of the connection between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain for higher level processing and impulse control. But it's also a really good example of a workplace accident where human error, specifically something called latent error modeling or the Swiss cheese model, which we'll talk about later, was at play. So he's included in our laboratory logo. Some of the things that we study in the lab are listed here, some of the safety topics, but broadly speaking, what we work on is unintentional injury prevention and unintentional injury etiology. And to define that, because this really plays into what we're going to talk about in terms of driving and pedestrian behavior later in the presentation. Unintentional injuries are things, they're incidents where either chemical or heat or physical force is applied to the body and it exceeds the body's capability of withstanding it. It's differentiated from intentional injuries. If someone punches you or cuts you, pushes you down, that's an intentional thing. It's not unintentional, right? So in the literature, we differentiate between those two terms for the purpose of research, but to the layperson, we're just talking about accidents here. So we study accidents, we study human factors, modeling and principles and application, safety, broadly speaking, and then some of the topics that I've done research on over the years are listed below. A lot of work on human perception with children and adult pedestrians. One of the topics we've worked on in the past was auditory perception in pedestrian environments, specifically with the Nissan Leaf. So when the Leaf was being developed, which is now 16 years ago, we did a series of studies looking at how people can localize and make judgments about approaching vehicles using only the auditory information, and sort of picking apart the pedestrian task to help inform the design of that vehicle and what kinds of frequencies should be in artificial noise. We do a lot of things. These days, my main focus is on the risk appraisal model, which I'll talk about a bit during tomorrow's presentation. It's a behavioral antecedent model for risk taking. We also do work on nuclear safety, oddly enough. I'm a developmental psychologist by training, but I never thought I would do work on nuclear safety, but we do work with Idaho National Laboratory on nuclear control room redesign, mainly looking at human factors principles and how the control room interfaces should be redesigned to prevent error, basically. So I just told you about this topic of unintentional injury to give you a sense of the scope of it. Can you all hear me very well when I'm not in front of the microphone?
No, not at all.
What if I come out here a little bit? Speak a little louder.
Use the microphone.
Feels really strange to me to be standing right there behind the mic. I never do that when I teach. I always walk around. So the problem of unintentional injury is a huge public health problem, and pedestrian safety and driving safety that we're going to talk about in a moment fall into this broad problem. Okay? What you have here is the top 10 leading causes of death ranked by the CDC across the age range. So we've got under 1 year of age, 1 to 4, and so forth. And then our top 10 leading causes of death down the left there. The blue rectangles are unintentional injury. So that shows you where it ranks among other common things, such as influenza, heart disease, suicide, homicide. The thing to really take in is that it's a major problem across the lifespan. And if you tally up the numbers in some of these columns, more people die from unintentional injury in a given year than the next 9 leading causes of death combined. We also have to understand that as we're going across the lifespan, they're not all the same kind of injury. As people get older, the majority of these are going to be occupational or motor vehicle related injuries. The next, one of the take-home messages I tell students when they see this is be sure to get your flu shot. It's listed as one of the top 10 leading causes of death. These data are from, I think, 2024, I think. Previous versions of this also had COVID listed in the top 10.
It's there at the bottom.
Oh, is it there too?
You're 1 to 4 years old.
Yeah, there we go. So I'm going to move on to the next slide here. The next one is going to show you the ranking of causes of injury deaths. So all of these deaths are all caused by unintentional injury of some kind. You can see across the top there, quite a few of them are or pretty close to the top, or sometimes all the way at the top is motor vehicle traffic injuries. For younger people, we're looking at things that are age typical. For young children, suffocations, poisonings, things like that, and falls also. And for older adults, falls are also a problem, but for very different reasons. It's usually something that rather than something that hasn't developed yet, it's something that's deteriorating, or a health problem has caused deterioration. It could be visual, it could be balance, it could be lack of regular physical activity or something like that. But this gives you a sense of the top 10. And these are all deaths. So the important thing to remember in terms of health impact, financial impact, is that there's far more people who were injured in incidents related to these kind of categories, but didn't pass away. So for those people, we have insurance costs, we have lost time at work, it's children, we have parents who couldn't go to work, medical costs. So there's a tremendous burden to society from this particular health problem. So hopefully these stats are kind of like showing you the breadth of the problem related to. I've only picked two things to talk about for transportation. It's going to be driving and pedestrian, but there's a lot of issues. And with motor vehicle related injuries, we're talking about a lot of subcategories. People being struck by cars, people being injured while driving, being in collisions, people being injured as passengers, people who are children who are in car seats. There's a lot of ways that can happen, but anything motor vehicle related, right? They're lumped into those categories. Okay, so our objective today, if you've had a brief introduction to what I do and kind of where my head is at when I look at this particular topic, we want to explore how understanding human behavior can help create transportation systems that anticipate human limitations. So how can we, if we understand human behavior, or how can human behavioral research of this kind help inform transportation systems? What can we take from the research that can give us practical things we can use? Right? And primarily we're going to talk about that in the under the umbrella of human factors. So the question is, how does psychology do this? We have this human behavioral research out there that we can use to inform development of safe transportation systems. What part of psychology does that come from? It comes from a lot of areas in psychology: cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, not really the helping professions, counseling and things like that, but the ones that are more focused on studying how people perceive things. So there's a variety of disciplines, but one sub-discipline that pulls it all together, and it's probably easier to see how this applies, is human factors. And I'm not sure who knows about human factors in the audience, so pardon me if I'm covering something you already know well. Does anyone have a really good background in human factors? Perfect. Neither do I. So I'm only partially joking. I wasn't trained in that area in grad school, but I am a research psychologist more than anything else. And human factors is something I kind of wandered into through the development of my career when I began working on pedestrian safety with children around 2002. And without realizing that I was actually doing human factors work, we just called it child safety work. And when I joined the faculty at the University of Idaho, I became part of the human factors program there. And began engaging in human factors research and a lot of self-education and professional education. This is an actual area if someone's interested in studying human factors, you can go to grad school and study just this. So if you haven't heard of human factors, the way I describe it to people who've never heard of it is we could describe it as a blend of engineering, art, and psychology. Engineering for designing things, psychology for understanding the people that those things are designed for. And then art, because we have some freedom of design when we're designing things, right? And that's all around us. The desks you're sitting at don't have to be exactly like that. The chairs don't have to be that way. They have a purpose they have to serve and a function that they have to fill, but there's a little bit of creativity you can have with the design of something. I don't know if you know the music producer Brian Eno is. You know David Bowie or Kraftwerk, bands like TiVo back in the day. Brian Eno was a music producer, still is. He lectures a lot on design and art. And I show my students one of his lectures in my human factors class, and talks about the question of what art is for and what design has to be. And he has a very simple example of a screwdriver as a continuum. On the one end of a screwdriver, it has to be made out of certain materials. It can't deviate from that. It has to be metal. It can't be wooden or plastic. The other end, where the handle is, you have more freedom. You can have plastic, different colors. It could be wood. There's still some limitations there in terms of what materials you can use. But we're going from something that has to serve a specific purpose where there's no freedom to design it a certain way or any other way, to the other end where we have some artistic freedom. It still has to be designed for the person, right? We still have some limitations. But that's where the artistic side of things kind of comes in for human factors. Because when we're talking about things like cell phone design, computers, office furniture, the inside of your car, the outside of your car, there's room for design freedom there, but it still has to serve a purpose. That's why I included the diagram as a quick way of explaining what it is. However, inside of human factors, we're really designing always for the user in mind. And the user may be a different type of person depending on what's happening. We call it human-centered design because the designs of things around us are done for the people who have to use them, right? We are the reason they exist. Roads are the reason they exist, or we are the reason roads exist, right? These things exist for us to use. We want to use them pleasurably. We want to use them safely. So human factors focuses a lot on the user experience. And who the user is depends on what the task is and what the space the product is that's being considered. So we design to enhance user experience. We design to increase safety. We design ways to prevent frustration, to prevent mistakes, right, to make things more intuitive. Also, it might just be satisfaction with the product. It might not be anything that's safety related. You could have minor differences in the satisfaction of a particular product in one company or another, and over thousands of people, that adds up. Right? We want people to buy your car. That was, in fact, what Nissan was doing when they were funding research, because there was no regulation at the time on artificial vehicle noise. So they wanted to design something that was pleasurable to listen to, that still did the job it needed to do, and needed to replace the sound of a combustion engine. And at the time, Toyota and GM were also developing systems that had different noises, different types of automation. So part of what they were doing was informing a safe system in the car, but also trying to design something that people would like because they wanted them to buy their product. But the overall theme in human factors we want to keep in mind as we go through the presentation, as we talk about driving behavior and pedestrian safety, is this idea of the task. A person has to do something with everything they have. They have to use a clicker, they have to use a cell phone, they have to use a chair, they have to pilot a vehicle, pilot an aircraft, right? There's a task you've got to do with whatever it is. It might be a very simple task, or it could be a very complicated task with multiple stages, right? But it's always about the task the person has to perform. And that's what we want to go back to when we think, how does this or that particular psychological thing inform road safety. What's the thing the person is trying to accomplish? It might just be driving straight, level. It might be navigating. I found myself on the way here engaging in some pretty serious navigational tasks. So don't spend a lot of time in Boise, right? And getting this direction during rush hour is not something I deal with in Moscow anymore. All the familiar frustrations and rage came back. I was used to when I was out east. So let's talk about what this task is, because in human factors we have this central thing we do. It's called the task analysis. And what a task analysis does is it breaks down the task into the smallest parts possible. And we'll start with a simple one on the left, one that we start our graduate students out with. The task is make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And you might say, it's easy. You get some butter, you get some jelly and some bread, and you put it on the bread and you're done. Put the two slices together, right? We know that as people who have done that. But what we want to do is we want to break it down into all the little sub-steps. First, you've got to get a plate, unless you want to make your sandwich on the countertop. Most people will get a plate. You get a plate, then you've got to find bread. Well, maybe you don't have bread. Maybe the bread's expired. Then you've got a subtask. You've got to go get bread. It comes down to organizing the materials, and then there's a procedure you need to follow after you organize the materials. And then you have your finished product. So that's a very, very basic example. But what if our task is something else? What if our task is something very complicated like flying an aircraft? You don't simply fly from one place to the next. There's many subtasks built into piloting an aircraft. And I'm not a pilot, so I'm going to beg for forgiveness if I don't get something right, but I don't know exactly what the first thing you would do would be. But I would assume you're going to be at the gate, you're going to do a walk around and make sure your aircraft is okay, right? And there are systems to check. There's things you've got to do before you ever push back from the gate. Or if you're getting into a private aircraft, there are things that need to be checked. After that, you've got other tasks. Taxiing to the gate, this is what this one diagrams. And this would be what we call a hierarchical task analysis, meaning that you have the overall task at the top, and then there are 5 subtasks. Each of those could be broken down further into more subtasks. Taxiing to the gate or taxiing to the runway is one task. The actual takeoff, leaving the ground, ascending is another task. Talking over the radio to air traffic control or the tower is a task. Monitoring the aircraft when you're cruising is a task. And then there's subsequent tasks that are complicated when the aircraft is approaching and landing and taxiing to the gate. So if you see what I mean, the overall task is fly the plane from one place to another. But we can break down all of that into smaller things. And that's where we find human perceptual failings or human perceptual needs. That's the important thing. When we talk about the characteristics of pedestrians and drivers, where we find these things are relevant is in specific parts of the task. For example, when someone is landing an aircraft, there's a lot going on. They're monitoring the descent, they're communicating with air traffic control, they're watching all the gauges, they're scanning, they're checking over and over again. It's a systems management problem, and there's a high amount of mental workload there. So a person's attention is limited. They're going to have so much they can apply, so much working memory they can use, so much distraction that they can withstand before they make an error. Right? So we want to build systems that support that. To some degree, training is going to be necessary, though. In a task like that, you're going to have to go out and train. You can't just do it. You can't design that task to the point where anyone could sit down and do it. There's going to be some training necessary. But for many tasks, we won't need that. Does this make sense? Yeah. So we take a task, we break it down. We'll talk about what the task is for a road user too. We break the task down, and that's where we look for the points where the human cognition, maybe working memory, or susceptibility to distraction, or developmental age differences, or physical abilities, or even social or cultural things might factor into where that task could fall apart as the person is doing. So I thought we would take a moment too to kind of tie this into the safe systems approach. And ask the question, where does human factors or psychology fit into this? Are we all familiar with this? I know some of us are, right? A little bit?
Some are, maybe not everyone though.
Okay, well, we'll go to a couple of links in a moment and explore briefly how human factors psychology or psychology in general links into this. But essentially we're looking at kind of a holistic approach to transportation safety. We're looking at the different broad factors. The road environment itself, the speed, the person or the human operator, the device that the operator is using or the vehicles. And I like that they even include post-crash care, because that's an important thing too. We often overlook that, you know. When we're talking about pediatric psychology, or human factors psychology, or whatever. I'm branching off a little bit there, but in child safety, it's closely related to pediatric psychology, which, among other things, investigates the impact of chronic illness on children. But injury fits in that category as well. And one thing that's not looked at enough, I think, is what happens after the injury. What kind of psychological care do children need after a severe injury if they spend time in the hospital, for example? We spend a lot of time looking at what leads up to it so we can prevent it, but not much time looking at what happens after. So this is very good too. I think there's, I'm not sure if they have this everywhere. There's an app up near Moscow with Life Flight up there. You can have the Life Flight app on your phone, and if you witness a crash and you're out on a highway somewhere, you can trigger that, and it will send information to them with GPS coordinates of where they need to go. Great thing for people to have on their phone, and they don't have to be a member or a paid user or anything to have that. Just one example. So the safe systems approach is a sort of a holistic thing, looking at how we can target all these different things, and people who are working on these particular topics can communicate and work together. We can accomplish a lot more. With ultimately our goal being 0 deaths. Talking about this a bit over lunch today, that it's a very difficult thing to achieve at a national level or even maybe at a state level, but we can probably do better with that sort of thing at a local level. It's hard to apply to everything all at once. So let's look at a couple of the links. Links with human factors psychology. How will I access these if I don't have a mouse? This thing?
You need to.
Yeah, I want to click on the links.
Okay, I can for you.
Oh, thank you.
The people one?
Yep. There we go. So we can scroll down. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Now, we'll have to kind of scroll down through these and talk about how it's defining. Things we're not going to help. So it gets right into behavioral safety factors and behaviors of people who are involved in crashes. But notice it talks about mistakes, lapses in judgment, and sort of human. It kind of portrays it as human failing, human weakness. Human factors would not portray it that way, but we're kind of still on the same page. It's really good that this is being acknowledged, that there are limitations to people and there are behavioral tendencies that humans have that are probably innate. We're not really going to change all this stuff. So if we can't educate and change everybody, then we can maybe design around that to some extent. Make sense? Let's see if I can go back to the other one. And again, we're back to designing a roadway to support human mistakes. It's kind of a central theme here that humans are going to make mistakes. Let me just move around over here. This is kind of hard to do backwards. That's actually a human factors principle violation. Trying to do that while turning around and having the planes of reference be different really slows you down and plays error. And in this case, we're looking at that tiny X in the upper corner. That's our goal, right? So focusing on the vehicle takes a lot of forms. We have a lot of assistive technology in vehicles these days. You're probably familiar with that. Navigational assistance, different types of cruise control. I was driving a vehicle the other day. I typically drive older vehicles. I have older vehicles, so I was driving one that had the headlights move in the direction that my steering wheel was going, so to illuminate the road a little bit more in that direction. All kinds of things that will enhance your ability to use it safely. But it goes back further than that. Designing safer vehicles actually goes back many decades to when cars used to be made of heavier metal, have metal bumpers, large hood ornaments, fins, and all kinds of things that are really cool to look at, but when someone is struck by those vehicles, a lot more damage is done. So vehicles these days are designed to dissipate that energy. The bumpers have foam inside them. The slope of the hood might even be designed to send a person up and over the vehicle rather than transferring all the energy into the body. And then inside the vehicle itself, there are things that tear apart and break away to dissipate the energy from the crash. Right? So designing vehicles to save lives, to reduce injuries, both for people who are struck by them or people who are in them when the crash occurs, that all falls into this category. And I think that's all more of a direct engineering thing. It's not so much of a human behavioral thing. We just know that, from kinesiology research, we can tell what the body can withstand. We know what kind of pressures it cannot withstand and what kind of surfaces can dissipate energy quickly. So I wanted to just touch base on those, just to kind of show how that stuff fits together. Speed, of course, I didn't really want to go to that one, but that's one that I didn't want to link to it, but speed is an interesting thing. Right? The higher your speed, the longer it takes you to stop, the more easily you lose control, the less traction you have, connection between the tires and the roadway. It drastically influences safety on the roadway for everyone involved. But it's a behavioral thing that we focus on a lot, right? Speeding tickets, speed enforcement, speed limits that are designed for the roadway at that particular point in the roadway. So that's why it's important not to treat them like suggestions, right? I was telling the folks at lunch that I actually was stopped yesterday on the way down here for the first time in probably 20 years for speeding. I'm not that kind of person, right? Why was I doing it? Because I was almost at the end of my journey, and I was getting a little heavy-footed and wanted to just get there, and the right place and the right time, someone was watching. Right? So I don't typically do that. I typically will drive the speed limit or maybe just over it, but people do it for all kinds of reasons. Some people love to do it because there's a thrill-seeking component there. There's actually a personality basis to continued thrill-seeking. That's established in literature. But it happens when a person is confronted with an environmental condition that allows them to engage in that. So that ties us back into the environmental component of the safe systems. Right? If the environment doesn't support it, the person can't engage in it, or they're going to have a really hard time doing it. I can give you a quick example too. In Moscow, there is a place, it's called the 6th Street Hill. It's a steep hill near downtown. It's always a problem because in the winter the ice is over, people slide down it and stuff. But there's a lot of people that bike that route going to work. And I was talking with a colleague one day about it. We had a study we did 15 years ago, where we put GPS trackers on people's bikes. We didn't just sneak up and put them on there. We actually got consent and everything. They were on there for a week, right? And so we could get speed data, time of day, location, and all that to see where people were going and try to correlate those behaviors with personality characteristics like impulsivity, inhibitory control, and thrill seeking, and extroversion. And it became very difficult to do that because people who are risk takers are not going around engaging in risky behavior all the time. But that, bring up that hill because that's a location where we did see a lot of that behavior. And it's only when a person has the opportunity at that point to engage in that risk behavior in that environment that it emerges. It's not always prominent in their behavior throughout the day. So it's very difficult to disentangle and understand and predict when these risk behaviors are going to emerge. And with something like speeding, controlling the speed, or even maybe going slower than you need to because the road surface is bad, it's very difficult to predict that kind of thing because very often it happens in the moment. And even a person who is sort of risk prone is not going to do it all the time. So the thing about human behavior that we have to sort of remind people about is that studying humans is very, very messy. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, but modeling and predicting human behavior is often has a lot of error, and the results are not necessarily clean. Any questions so far? Yeah.
When I became a professional driver, when I get behind the wheel, I'm at work.
Yeah.
I'm not thinking about what I gotta do at home, chores. That is work. And I think that's the biggest difference between the pros and those who didn't get the training like I did.
Are you talking about commercial truck driving or something like
Yeah,
that?
I did a lot of that.
Yeah.
But I apply it in my own vehicle, on my bicycle, pedestrian. It's like the movement.
Yeah.
I'm a pro.
Yeah,
With a lot
and
of training.
And you take it with you when you're outside of it. right?
Absolutely.
Because it's not like you're going to stop doing it. It becomes your habit. You're always going to do it. One of the things we did inside of the bio, and we talked about over lunch also, was that I was a Moscow Police Reserve for 6 years, level 1 reserve, which is, Idaho level 1 is fully solo. So I would come in, for 6 years I would come in and do at least 20 hours a month, sometimes 80, get the patrol car and go out. And we did the same thing. You learn these habits. It's like shuffle steering or how to use braking and acceleration to load the wheels when you're going around curves. And they taught us things like apexing curves and doing things to bleed the pressure off of the suspension issue so you wouldn't lose control when you came out of a curve. And you're absolutely right, it doesn't turn off. I still do some of that stuff. It's been 6 or 7, 8 years since I've done that, but I still do weird things like I take my seatbelt off right before I get home because I'm so used to going to domestic disturbances and being unbuckled before I got, so I could just jump out of the car if I needed to, right? Or doing the shuffle steering, which is really great. It's a weird type of steering where you don't cross the center line because you don't want your arm to get thrown back at you if the airbag goes off. But you also have a ballistic vest on and you really can't do much. You're like a turtle. Right? That's a really great point. I'm glad you brought that up. And what we're talking about is, I think a lot of what we're talking about is the general public who doesn't have the training. People who have only the required training, maybe driver's education, or maybe they just got someone taught them how to drive, a relative or something. Okay, so let's talk about the two topics I wanted to bring up and sort of offer examples for were driving behavior and pedestrian behavior. In the injury literature, at least the psychological literature on injury behaviors and prevention, pedestrian safety is the biggest category that's been examined. And before we get there, I can go ahead and preface that by saying we're not really concerned as much about how people cross streets as we are with applying the things we learn from those studies to other things. people crossing through streets, and people crossing through traffic, and people who are driving cars, driving and pedestrian research, being the two subfields, we can take a lot from that and extrapolate it to other injury problems. Because those two things offer us really good ways to look at how people interact with dynamic environments. Where a lot is going on, where we have a lot of mental processing, a lot of ways to look at human tendencies, to look at the cognitive shortcomings of working memory and information processing. So I picked them for this to talk about some of the limitations, to kind of tie back into the safe systems approach a little bit, and talk about how the task of doing driving or crossing the street shows us where we can apply some of the psychology to help people out. So first, drivers. And it's important that we conceptualize driving as a human factors task in order to understand this. There's a lot going on when you're driving. First of all, it's a continuous thing. It's not simply operating the vehicle. Even when we're cruising down a straight level highway and it's good weather, we're still engaging a lot of our cognitive skills. They're not taxed as much, but they're being used. Drivers have to kind of constantly go through that loop of perceiving, deciding, and acting on something every few seconds, whether it's checking your instruments or it's controlling your lane position, scanning for hazards, driving down here. One of the things you got to do, you got to scan for deer, especially certain times of day. You have to watch out for slow vehicles. Right? I was telling someone today about the drive down, when you come down from Cascade down to 155. There was that windy stretch there. You really have to pay attention there. I personally don't like it because I can never take my eyes off the vehicle in front of me. Yeah.
Those are the places that you stay alert.
Right.
The straightaways are the dullness.
That's
Those
true.
are where hazards are.
People- yeah.
Salem to Eugene, I think, nightmare.
I don't know if I've driven that way, but you're right about that because we disengage.
Absolutely.
There's not a lot being, and that's one of the things that we do when we talk about automated systems, which I think we're going to touch on at the very end here, is that automation is great, but people stop paying attention to the main task. They disengage and they get out of the loop. So having lane assist or having cruise control and things like that, it means you're not doing as much. You do start to get complacent and your reaction time increases when something does happen to you.
Yeah, there's a book I read called Traffic, and it talks about how actually unsafer roads make people safer drivers because they have to focus more on the task rather than become complacent. With the wider roads that we build now, they can kind of go into autopilot and they're less aware and then have a slow reaction time when something pops out.
It's also really good for skill building too. One of my former grad students is a pilot, a helicopter pilot, Coast Guard. He was in the Army before that, so he's got about 30 years of experience flying helicopters. We wrote a few articles for different military journals based around some of the real things he's seen, and complacency, and when pilots start to make mistakes. Right around 1,000 hours, start to make mistakes. That's when many of them have their first mishap, or perhaps a crash. And part of it is because if they've gotten their first 1,000 hours flying in great weather, with no threats and nothing's gone wrong, yeah, they got 1,000 hours, but that 1,000 hours didn't educate them the way 1,000 hours flying in combat or storms would educate you. It's true, it's good to be pushed, and it's good to have something to keep you engaged. Those are very good comments, though. And that ties into a thing I'll talk a little bit more about tomorrow, which is this issue of what is experience with a task, too. Experience is not just time that you've done the task, it's what's happened during the task. How many mistakes have you made? A driver who's had a couple of accidents may be a better driver, may be a wiser driver than the person who's never had a problem. But I think we tend to look at that as the person who's never had a problem is the better driver. Yeah, so it's a human factors task if you want to think about it that way. And we have to think about what mental work does it require? What kind of mental load is a person experiencing? And then how can the roadway design, traffic flow, signals, things around the roadway support that? So what's the task and where are the weak points? That's one way of putting it. And then how can we design the system on the road, in this case, to support that and make things safer? So we've got a diagram here that I actually pulled from one of the textbooks I used to teach human factors engineering design. And it's just a basic design of what the task might look like for a driver. It's kind of piston shaped, piston and crankshaft. But you've got a vehicle, your primary task as a driver really is just piloting that vehicle and keeping the speed where you want it and keeping the lane position where you want it. That's the heart of it, right? But there's a lot of other stuff going on too. You've got a curve in the roadway, controlling speed, dealing with in-cab things, dealing with radio, communication, navigation. Those things take your attention away from the primary task.
Your analysis must include an escape route.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because you're supposed to have an escape route. You shouldn't be too close behind somebody. Yeah. There could be a lot of things. And if you're a first responder, you're going to be doing a lot of things in the computer now. Looking at the calls coming in. When I was being trained for that, we were never allowed to escape route. We were never allowed to be too close to the car in front of us in case we had to get out. Then there's also responding to something. You're always trained to go to the left because drivers are going to dive to the right. You don't want to go around to the right because they might pull in front of you. But other things like, I think human patrol cars actually, if you've ever sit in one or do a ride along or watch what an officer does, they're human factors disasters. Because there's incredible amounts of not only ergonomic problems, but also technological problems. I'm moving a little slow, so I'm going to get moving a little faster, but I did want to add to that when you're using a computer or radio or something like that, it dramatically affects your ability to drive properly. And I remember in training, I sailed right through a red light. And the sergeant was sitting next to me and just turned and looked at me. I knew I had done something wrong. I didn't know what it was. Because they wanted me to use that computer and type things and watch the calls coming in while I was driving and operating the radio. And their philosophy was, you need to be better at doing all those things. And I was like, you can't, because people can't do all those things. Right? So, but those are all the things that are going on. So searching for hazards, looking at signs, looking at the road users, planning navigation, escape routes, and all these things, but also route, controlling the vehicle. And I think what we do a lot of in driver's education is we focus on controlling the vehicle more than anything else. But none of these tasks happen independently. They all are happening at the same time, and they all compete for sometimes the same mental resources, other times it's different ones. You probably immediately recognize the problem. Imagine if you're driving down the highway and you see that, you're trying to figure out which route to take. That's a good example of something that's inappropriately taxing visual and working memory. Because yeah, you can see it, you have all the information you need to make a decision there, but it's very complicated. It's going to slow your processing speed down. So it's taxing things like selective attention, there's divided attention. There are a number of ways that attention can fail. One of them is inattentional blindness or shade blindness. But basically, roadways need to be designed in ways that support people's limited attention capability. This information that the driver needs, it needs to be given to them in a way that doesn't take them a lot of effort to pick it up. If you're curious about reading about this sort of thing, there's a researcher named David Strayer who has numerous studies on the topic of distraction among drivers. And driving simulator studies where they manipulate different types of these things in virtual reality courses. we have mental workload. So mental workload is just the process of using all those cognitive capabilities. When there's more complexity or something's new, unexpected events and complexity being the two top and bottom things, typically when those things, more than anything else, become elevated, we see people's processing slow down. Mental workload increases. There's a concept in human factors called information theory that it's not really a theory, it's just a simple sort of explanation for how this happens. And the central part of it is that people can only process so much information at one time. It's a bottleneck, right? Your brain can only process things so fast. It can only handle so many sources of information. As soon as you're confronted with something that becomes more complicated, it slows the processing down. Or if it's unusual, unexpected, it slows the processing down. So going back to our example, if you're driving on a straight and level road in great weather, and you're disengaged, something pops up, you're not ready for it, right? But even when you are paying attention, if that's a really unexpected thing, you're going to process it a little slower. We might be talking about 50 milliseconds. That might make all the difference. In studies of drivers where people are following vehicles, and we're studying the braking profile of following vehicles. The vehicle brakes in an unexpected way. And we're studying how collisions are avoided. When you get people more information about what's happening, it makes it more accurate, but it slows them down. And you can actually cause more collisions than prevent them. More information or unexpected information slows down processing. So we want to get across the things we need to drivers and pedestrians and really anybody who's performing a dangerous task in a way that that doesn't bog them down. You know. That's why I have the signs up there. Where that
Can you
is.
go back to that other one about the last one?
This one here?
Humans cannot attend everything. So is that why people turn the radio down when it gets congested?
Yeah, you gotta turn the radio down so you can see better.
Is that part of it?
Well, kind of. I mean, we all know that that's an interesting question because there's a human factors approach called multiple resource theory that just looks at the different sensory modalities that a task requires. Is it primarily a visual task, or is it a motor task, or is it auditory? If there's a secondary thing you have to do, a distractor, and it uses the same sensory modality, it slows you down tremendously. So if a person has to do a secondary thing while they're doing the primary task, it's better to have it presented to them in a sensory modality that's not already being used. And I think people, when I joke about turning the radio down so you can see better, I think it's really just more, listening to the radio is not really interfering with your vision, but it is interfering potentially with your processing because you're starting to do a task. And it just makes it easier without the distractions being a primary thing. All right, let's get into working memory. So if you're not familiar with this, working memory is similar to you've got working memory and you've got temporary memory or short-term. Short-term memory would be what you might do to remember a phone number back when we used to have to do that. Now we just put it in the phone and we call each other or whatever, or text. But if you had to remember a number from the phone book to go dial it, or maybe a more relevant example might be remembering a code or something from an email or text that you got so you can log into something. Anytime we would do that, we're using the short-term memory. We're holding that information there, and then we're getting rid of it, and it's getting erased as soon as we don't need it anymore. Working memory is similar to this, but it involves holding that information in your consciousness and using it and manipulating it in some way. So we see this a lot with children and drivers, child pedestrians in particular. And I had a slide, I tried so hard to find an old slide I had that showed visual search patterns of children versus adults in one of our early studies in the lab, when children were confronted with a spot the difference task. And children to do the same task as an adult when they're looking for a place to cross the street. They're accomplishing the same task, sometimes in about the same amount of time, but the cognitive load is dramatically higher. And they will search all over the field, whereas adults will constrain their search just to where it needs to be, and they'll get there really fast. Right? So adults are doing a lot less work because of experience, but also because their processing speed is faster. But working memory is a thing that is very limited. It's typically something we're trying to problem solve, especially in a navigational task or something. I found myself doing that on the way over here, getting caught in traffic, being confronted with routes that were closed, trying to avoid other routes, using my phone to navigate, and having Google give me routes that I knew were bad. They kept trying to push me the routes that I had already been there. I was close. I know that's the best route, but it's not today. Right? So the human operator still needs to know that. You have to have that overarching knowledge to know that the system is giving you information you can't really use. But while I'm looking at that, I'm also trying not to run a red light or a stop sign or turn onto a one-way street in the wrong direction. All the things that could have gone wrong. The working memory was being taxed very heavily because I was navigating and not getting good navigational information too. Only having to use my spatial memory and try to figure out, where I am in the city, because I have somewhat of a working knowledge of where I might be in relation to other things, but not a very good knowledge. So, but working memory is a thing that's similar to short-term memory. It's a key thing to remember. We're using it constantly. It might be used heavily one moment, not the next. But a lot of it has to do with looking at the things around us and making judgments about them. Monitoring speed, monitoring the position of surrounding vehicles. What is someone else doing? Are they making a lane change? Are they slowing down? Are they trying to get around me? What are the traffic signals telling us? So having simpler layouts and simpler, more straightforward ways of giving drivers information is a way to reduce this burden. And this next slide, this is really one of the central parts of the human part, or the person part of the safe systems approach. The people are imperfect. We should expect that people will be imperfect and make mistakes. Not because, I wouldn't characterize humans as flawed, I would just say that that's how we operate. We're built that way. We don't process information the way a machine would. We process it the way a person would. We cut corners. We have bad habits that develop. We use heuristics. We have quick and dirty ways of processing things and making judgments the way a machine would never do. We also are always looking for patterns in things. Humans are really good at planning ahead and looking at patterns and judging on them in ways that computers are not. But even though we do all of that, we're still not perfect at it. So we're not perfect at judging distance, especially when the object is farther away from us. I think there's probably an evolutionary reason for that part, too. We're okay at judging speed. You can actually look at a vehicle and judge speed fairly accurately after a few tries, but you need to have visual cues around it to do it. Time to arrival, excuse me, is another one of these things. Time to arrival or time to contact, which is a perceptual judgment we're using whenever we're pulling up behind another vehicle or when you're catching a ball, right? It has to do with where you know that you are in physical space. People don't really do time to arrival estimates in an accurate way. They do it with a heuristic. So we can often get it wrong. And we've actually tested that in my lab, both visually and auditorily, having people do time to arrival judgments with only sound. And people aren't too bad at it after a few tries. People are pretty good at locating stuff, but most of these things are very, very visual. So visual perception is the dominant modality. So the important thing to remember is we're not perfect, but we don't measure, we estimate. We make estimations, and there are a lot of things that can mess up our estimation. So a researcher I can refer you to, Patricia Duishek, who's done a lot of work on time to arrival estimates. and how things like speed, color, and size of the vehicle influence that. We know that size of the vehicle, some of her studies are subtitled Size Matters. And obviously it's a joke here, but it's true though, because a larger vehicle actually projects a much larger image in your eyes. So you actually there's a physiological underpinning for why we recognize that and why we miss things like motorcycles.
I have a question. You
Yeah.
use the term heuristic. What is that?
Heuristic is like, how do we describe it? A bias, things like biases or stereotypes are examples of heuristics. Basically, they're ways of solving problems and making judgments without having to go through all the steps. You know, you think maybe a math example might be a good one too. Doing a math problem where you're showing every single step, that's the way a computer needs it. And that's the way a machine would do it. But a human can jump steps. In doing that, we relieve ourselves of a lot of cognitive burden, makes it a lot easier and quicker for us to do things, but the cost is we have an elevated chance of getting it wrong. So that leads us, this imperfect perception leads us to this topic coming up. When I was preparing this, of why I didn't see that. People say, well, I pulled out in front of this person, I didn't see him. Just didn't see him there. It's possible someone just didn't see someone. I was watching a comedy special on Netflix a few nights ago, and the person started off their routine with talking about how they were hit by a bus. And he says, when you're hit by a car or a motorcycle, people sympathize, but if you get hit by a bus, they'll ask, why didn't you see it coming? It's so big, right? It's possible to lose vehicles or people behind parts of the car. I've lost entire cars behind my mirror, just depending on where they're at and how my car is angled, right? And those are just visual occlusions, but it could also be a cognitive thing. It could be a distraction thing. We do have instances where we just don't see something happen. So looking at something is not the same as processing and seeing. And even if we are looking and we're seeing, we're processing, we still have things that are not perfect. So one of the things that we worked on in my research line years ago was this issue of having children looking at traffic. And researchers who were working on child pedestrian behavior, they would measure attention to traffic as the number of times the child turned their head left or right. I'm like, well, that's great, but we don't know what they're looking at. Because I've literally seen children walk up to a roadway, turn their head left and right and go. Because they were taught to look left and right. Well, they did it. They looked left and right. And I think it's an interesting comparison to talk about the fire safety thing of stop, drop, and roll. It's probably all we're taught as kids. We know it works by suffocating the fire, right? One of the ways. It takes the oxygen out of it. You don't need to know that in order for it to work. You just have to do the thing. When it comes to looking at traffic, you gotta know what you're looking for. It's not just looking at it. And so we started doing these eye tracking studies and connecting them with the cognitive factors that children have that are still developing. And visual search and attention to things in the roadway are the dominant ones that children are still developing. They look, but they don't see and they don't process. But the same thing can happen to us as adults. So the next slide, I have an unfortunate example. This is a location about 3 miles north of Moscow. And I can turn myself around here. It was a fatal crash only a few weeks ago, July 16th. The person who passed away happened to be an acquaintance of mine. Not a close friend, but someone I still knew fairly well. He was coming south on the highway, coming into Moscow, and a man in a Toyota turned left in front of him, and they collided. And my friend passed away at the scene there. I went out to it because I typically do this in Moscow. If I know about a particular crash, I go out, I'm curious what the environment looks like and what kind of things might have contributed to it. In this case, you can look at it there. The view you have here is the view of the driver. The truck involved, the truck in the picture is not part of it, this is just a Google Street View thing. But this is the view that the driver who turned in front of the motorcyclist would have had, coming over a hill. You can see there's not really any visibility problems. It was daylight when it happened. It happened pretty much right in front of where the white truck is in the photo. We just didn't see the motorcyclist. We could say, oh, it was an 87-year-old man. Well, we don't know what his visual or cognitive perception is like. There are drivers at that age who have very good cognitive functioning. We don't know that that's a factor. That's not in the report. But having gone out there and looked at it, there's no visual problems. The roadway was clear, you know. So how does this happen? Right? Would you say that this roadway is poorly designed and in some way contributed to the crash?
One of the things I think he's looking at is eliminating at-grade crossings. So if you had a situation like this, you'd wanna, this is an accident intersection, but if you had a, I don't know, better way to enter the roadway, it's a dangerous intersection because.
He was turning left to go onto that road past where the white truck is, but yeah, and everyone coming down that road is traveling 65 miles an hour. If they're behaving, they might be going faster.
Yeah.
So you are pulling out from there at a dead stop to go out, you know, into traffic. Probably what happened is this was a person who lived in the area, they were used to doing this, they simply missed the motorcycle. They just didn't see it. And people, that happens to motorcyclists a lot, unfortunately.
Two-wheelers tend to have high velocities. So the 87-year-old might have made an observation that oncoming two-wheeler with a headlight is a half mile down the way, but doesn't realize they're doing 95.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And if you go look, Patricia Luce's research actually talks about that. People will misestimate or underestimate, or heuristics are coming into this. The time to arrival, the approach time, the rate of speed is misjudged because of the size of the vehicle. They either don't see it, or they'll see a large vehicle and think it's going slower than it really is. A number of factors can go wrong. It can be either way, really. They can think it's going slower than it really is, or faster. It's hard to say. There also aren't a lot of objects along the roadway that serve as really good reference points for the motion of the vehicle here too. And that's the one thing I probably would point out in this situation in terms of road design. I'm not saying they should put posts down the highway, but this is a situation where people have to be a little more careful.
As a motorcyclist, I've known him from riding for 50 years. I know I've come across that often, not every day, but I know that people are looking for a particular shape in their unconscious driving process. I'm not that shape. And so therefore I'm not registering. And I just expect it.
You're thin, probably.
Yeah, it's thin.
Yeah. This particular motorcycle was a white Harley Davidson, but it was like soft tail, didn't have any
So it's
bags or
thin.
anything. Yeah, it's pretty. Yeah, the guy that was riding it was a pretty thin guy too. So he didn't really didn't occupy a big space. It's unfortunate. I wanted to throw it up here because it was one of those I didn't see it happen. I mean, I didn't see the vehicle type of things. It's one of these situations where the road is not really a particularly dangerous part. It's not poorly designed. There's not a particular, severe safety factor that I could point out here. Everything looks pretty good. The conditions were good. It was daytime. I think it was late in the afternoon, but still, no real obvious factors to point to. And yet we still have some perceptual failings happening. I'm not sure that we could do much here with this kind of thing. This is not advancing.
I just cover my brake.
See if I can. Okay, Amy, what did I do wrong here? In one
Not
advance.
advancing?
No. One over here, I don't know. Is that the projector? This is what happens in class on university, so I just use the keyboard.
Wait, we really are stuck. No, I will go back here. out and open it up again.
Okay.
Oop. Okay, just have it there. I'll try.
Oh, I'm good to go. Yes, sir. I'll turn it off and turn it back on.
Escape, now try, you've got the mouse, put it back.
Okay, this responding to this now. So you want me to start the, start the presentation up again? Let's go on to pedestrians. That's all the material I have on drivers for you. Pedestrian safety is a thing I got into right at the beginning of my career. I was actually still in grad school, and I was doing work on child social development, things like bullying and children's friendships and things like that, social stuff. And I started working with a professor who was doing child safety research, and then I ended up veering into pedestrian safety. I was fascinated that there was a field in psychology that did this. I didn't know psychologists did this stuff when I was in grad school until 3 years from the end there. So I did a number of studies on pedestrian safety, and these days I'm doing some risk modeling work and some theoretical stuff in my lab, but this is still a very, very good field within safety psychology from which we can draw a lot of principles. We can get a lot out of what we've learned about how people interact with traffic and apply that to other areas. Again, it comes down to the task. What's the task that a pedestrian has to do? They're using the same space as a driver. That's a key thing I forgot to mention earlier, but it's a central theme in tomorrow's presentation, that road users are using the same space, right? You know, with something like a computer or a clicker, one person's using it at a time. There's not multiple users all using it at the same time. But with a road, there are, and they can't occupy the same spot at the same time. That's how we get crashes, right? So the question then becomes, what's the task they've got to do? So a pedestrian's task is a little different than a driver's task. They're not moving at the same speed, but they're interacting with drivers. Drivers are interacting with them. So because the consequences are very severe for a pedestrian, much more so than a driver, there's a lot more of looking at things and making judgments. And this differs quite a bit whether we're talking about children or young adults or older adults. You're continuously solving cognitive problems while interacting with traffic that's constantly changing. So you can see how it can become a really good place to study child perception, how children's brain development affects what they're able to do in a pedestrian situation. This is gives you a sense of the task. Yeah.
Which of your bullet points includes compliance with the law? Is that decision making?
Yeah, you can put it there. Yeah. Following traffic rules. Yeah. It also might include route selection. Children planning a route through a space. Because when we're talking about crossing streets, no one's just really walking across one street. It's going to be a child who's walking to school, or a person who's walking to work or something. They're crossing multiple streets, and every one of those streets they cross has a different traffic flow and has different perceptual limitations. So they're constantly having to adjust. It also would just simply mean the decision to go or not go, to proceed through the traffic. And one of the things that we're really looking at in the task is gap selection. So people are detecting approaching vehicles. Is there a vehicle there at all? If it is, where is it and what's it doing? How fast is it coming? Is it too fast for me to get in front of it? Do I have to wait? If you misestimate the arrival time, well, you can get in trouble. You get caught in the roadway and the vehicle's there before you realized it. Looking at crossing opportunities, and we typically would study that in a stream of traffic, and we can manipulate the gaps in cars in a virtual reality environment, and we can scale that to a person's walking speed so that they're getting gaps that they can't cross, gaps they can, and stuff that's kind of in the middle. That's where people make most of their mistakes, by the way. Some things are a little bit ambiguous. It's just a little bit too small to cross through, or maybe just big enough. That's where you start to see children's perceptual failings emerge. And I shouldn't say failings, just their cognitive capabilities, right? It's when they're having to push a little harder and make a judgment. If it's obviously big enough or obviously not big enough, they're not going to cross the road. But you also see things like very young children who won't cross if a car is present at all, even if it's just parked. Because the rule they're applying is, if there's a car, I don't cross. The rule is very black and white. Right? It's not dynamic. They've been taught if there's cars, you don't cross. Or the car can be really far away and they will wait for it to go past before they'll cross when they could have made it cross. Adults do things like start to cross before the car is gone. We will step into the roadway and use the 3 feet we have between us and the car as a way to maximize the space we still have. And we label that anticipating. It really doesn't matter what it's labeled. We're just maximizing the space we have, the time we have, but adults have better speed judgment abilities and time to arrival abilities. We're just better at it, we're faster at it, we're more experienced at it. Children don't have the flexibility to do that. There's also a lot of visual stuff going on that we can measure too. Scanning, fixating on certain topics, and the effect of distraction too. Children's selective attention skills are still developing, and they don't reach adult levels until early adolescence. And even then, they're not really able to integrate the information as fast as an adult could. So it's important to look at what they're looking at, how they're searching that environment, and how they're integrating that information. This goes back to the looking and seeing but not processing, or looking but not seeing something. So for very young children, even a simple crossing can be very, very cognitively demanding. The critical question always is, do I have enough time to get across before that vehicle arrives? It requires estimating at least those 3 things: vehicle speed, distance, and your personal ability to get through that. And there's a thing there underneath that last point called the perception of affordances. I don't know if you've heard, anyone that has a background, has heard about Gibson's theory of affordances. Right? It's a very interesting and I think very intuitive theory that talks about how people perceive space around them. And one of the key concepts is what the world allows us to do. It's called affordances, right? So an affordance is simply a thing that something in your environment allows you to do. So for us, standing on the floor, it affords support, right? This would probably not afford support for me. It could. I don't know, for sure, right? But it's a surface just like the floor. The walls are surfaces as well. For an insect, they can walk on that surface. For us, we can. So what an environment affords or offers an individual really is about the characteristics of the individual matched with the characteristics of the environment, and then the person makes a judgment about what they can do in that environment. Right? So that's where judgment of affordances comes in. A colleague of mine did some interesting studies with children, just basic studies of reaching for objects on shelves, and we can map that to gap selection in the simulator, where we have things that are out of reach, obviously within reach, and things that are just outside the child's reach or just within. And those ambiguous categories is exactly where we see things like personality characteristics and impulsivity is the big one. Thrill-seeking behavior or lack of experience, or even inhibition, because people who are highly inhibited will underestimate what they can do. All those things actually happen in a pedestrian environment as well. And it's very much a place where you're estimating your affordances, because you've got moving objects and you've got a space you've got to move through. And you've got to make a judgment about whether you are capable of doing that thing before the critical point arrives at which the car closes the gap. So children have a lot of development going on across middle childhood. Middle childhood being like age 5 to about 11 or 12. There's a lot of development going on these 4 things. Their ability to filter out irrelevant information is a big one. their executive functioning or high-level cognitive capabilities is developing. Inhibitory control, or ability to resist impulsive behavior, is getting better, right? And speed perception is getting pretty good too. But people used to ask me, when I was working with children a lot, they would ask me, it was usually like an organization that wanted to put out some information for parents. At what age should children be allowed to walk to school alone?
20.
Some parents say never. The answer is about 10 or 11, but it really depends. So there's not a straight answer. I would not allow my child to walk to school at age 10. But, you know, it depends on the child's ability, because there are 10-year-olds who actually process things more like a 6-year-old and vice versa. There's a lot going on in that age range with children where these skills, these cognitive skills are dramatically developing, but it depends on whether they've been allowed to exercise them. Right? So you can do that with training to some degree. We've shown that training at roadside, training in simulators, all works to a large degree. If it's knowledge-based training, but it has to have a behavioral component. You got to get them out there and have them do the thing in order for those concepts they're learning to solidify. Did you have a question?
Yeah, it looks like your bottom bullet here probably addresses my question, but I was wondering if the behavior that kids learn when pedestrians don't do the things right, kind of getting back to what you asked about, do they learn bad behavior? And it looks like your study probably talks about that.
What do you mean exactly?
So if people are jaywalking, for instance, and take risks that they shouldn't, and their kids watch them, do they learn to take risks that they shouldn't?
Oh, learning vicariously.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be, there's a social psychological theory, social learning theory, developed by Alfred Bandura. You might remember if you had a psychology class and there was the whole thing with the children and the clown doll, and they're hitting the doll with a hammer. Is that just not landing? I never know what you had with people. That's a very old study. It was developed to look at how children learn aggressive behaviors. They would see an adult attacking this clown doll and beating it with a hammer. And it depends on whether the person is reinforced or punished for doing that. Right? So it's about modeling behaviors. Children learn from watching adults do this stuff. And if you watch an adult do that sort of thing, you know it's risky, but the person does it and they get away with it, they're successful. You've just seen someone do it and get reinforced for it. So watching someone do that and get reinforced strengthens your own tendency to do the same thing. So one of the best ways of training children is to have them be with an adult and have the child lead the crossing, but have the adult be there to stop them if they make a bad decision. It always reminds me of when I was in high school taking driver's ed. And the driving instructor had his own brake pedal. And I tried to make a left when I wasn't supposed to. And what's wrong with the car? It won't go. And he's just sitting there. He's like, you're not going to do that. He was very relaxed about it. And then I saw his foot with the brake pedal pushed to the floor. So I was there to do the driving task on my own, but he was there as a safety net. Letting children cross roads by themselves with no adult supervision is not a great idea. And also, having the adult do all the work is depriving them of an opportunity to learn. So those are some of the best ways to do it. But it can be done in virtual reality. It can be done in real life. The colleague there, David Schwabel, who's the first and last thing there, we did a meta-analysis on this some years ago. A meta-analysis is looking at studies across the literature. And we found thousands of studies from the 1960s onward where people tried to do pedestrian training with children. Quite a lot of them were very bad. We were able to distill that down to a smaller group that was done well and look at what works. It's always got to have a behavioral component where the child can be the decision maker, but in a safe environment. Let's move on. Another group that's affected greatly is older adults. I've done some work with older adults in pedestrian behavior, primarily with auditory perception. But some of the same things apply. Visual processing is very often compromised by vision, macular degeneration or something like that. Speed of processing is sometimes decreasing, so reaction time is increasing. There might be physical impairments that affect walking speed and decision speed too. There's not as much work out there on older pedestrians. There's a lot more work on older drivers. And we know from that age is definitely not everything. When you look at if you plot abilities or reaction times or whatever the case may be, whatever this psychological factor is that has an effect on risk taking, if you plot that, and you look at it across the lifespan, children are all over the place. And then in early adulthood, everybody gets really clustered together. And then older years, it spreads out again. But the important thing to remember is you still have people who are over 90 who have reaction time and visual processing and speed of processing, everything is just as good as someone who's, say, 25 years old, right? So age is definitely not everything when it comes to driving or pedestrian behavior, but it's important to remember there still are developmental changes that we have to be aware of. Yeah.
It's not may, it's will.
Or are, I think it's an
Will be attracted by. Yes, that's true. That's a good point, yeah. And on the topic of phones, too, there's actually a lot of work out there, just on people falling while they're walking and using a phone. Not even crossing the street, they just fall. A colleague of mine and I developed an app some years ago it was an Android app that we installed with the phone and it ran in the background and collected data, but it was, if you're past your lock screen, your phone knows that. It knows what you're using, it knows if you're moving, it knows whether the app you're using is something that requires reading or preparing text or listening to music or something like that. And we developed this app so that it would sense this and it would know when a person was around the street. And it would pop up warnings, like, head up, phone down, things like that, or it would flash statistics and try to scare them a little bit or something. But you're right, it's actually, it's a will thing. Texting is always a distraction. Conversations, headphones, being preoccupied by some sort of thing you're worried about, it's still taking your attention off of the main task.
I was gonna challenge you for your opinion, the app that's alerting you that you're gonna crash and burn. Put the damn phone down and
Yeah.
pay attention to what you're doing.
What we were trying to do was to take the exact thing that was causing the distraction and turn it into a method for data collection.
I'm very concerned about the dependence. The curve is going sky high.
People just being dependent on their phones all the time. Yeah. It becomes habitual too. Because if you're like me, you've had a moment where things get a little bit boring or something, and all of a sudden your phone is out. So why am I looking at Instagram again? Why am I checking my email the third time this hour when I don't need to? It becomes reflexive because you're just used to doing it when you get a little bit bored. It's nice to not have these things, to have them put away. It is a huge problem though, and texting while driving is still a huge problem. I like the fact that we have some laws that nationwide that allow law enforcement to address that, but it still doesn't have a lot of teeth. In Idaho, the law is just nestled underneath the careless and reckless driving codes, and it says that the person has to be sending, preparing, or reading text-based messages while the vehicle is in motion. But it's not probable cause to stop a vehicle. So you can't stop someone because they're texting. You have to stop them for something else, and then the person actually has to admit to doing it. And you can't seize the phone and prove they were doing it. So,
Subpoena will get it.
well, if it was an accident and they were serious about it, yeah. Otherwise, officers are limited to doing verbal tricks. So instead of asking or saying you were texting there, I saw you texting, you can just deny that. Why were you texting? Or it's like, when a server comes to you in a restaurant, instead of saying, would you like some dessert, they'll say something like, how much room did you leave for some delicious ice cream or something? I phrase it a different way. Similar things to get people to react in such a way that they will admit they were texting or reading something while they were driving. And you can see people do it. You can see the glow on their face at night when they're texting and driving.
Well, I have a question, how do you know they're not looking at the map?
You don't. You would ask a question like, is there a reason you were texting while you were driving back there? It's accusatory. But people, instead of asking or saying, I think you were texting, I stopped you because you were texting, or I saw you texting, you just hit them with an accusation. And people will say something, or they'll confess to it, basically. What I'm getting at, though, is it's a really weak way to be able to enforce that kind of thing, right? There's so much we need to be doing when it comes to this particular problem. Distraction in general. Legal methods are only going to get us so far. I do like technological based methods where you can have something show up on the phone while the person's driving or shuts the phone off or something like that. Some of the problems that arise with that, though, is that these things are treated by the law as computers. So this is the same as your personal computer. You can't just take it, and they can't take it from you, they can't do things to it. When I say they, I mean law enforcement or anybody who might be involved in it.
Do they know that, or just you know that?
People know it. I mean, it's, a police officer can't take it and search it. Someone can't force you to install an app on it that shuts it off. You could, for example, if you were working somewhere and they say, we don't want you using your phone while you're driving, it's your personal phone. There's limitations on what they can do with your personal property. If it's a work phone and they gave it to you, they can do different things to it. Right? I guess what I'm getting at is we're still grappling, everybody, all the fields that are involved in this that are grappling with what to do about this problem, because it's obvious that people need to not be distracted, but how do we get that point?
I thought I heard a public safety announcement the other day on the radio while I was driving about your hands can't be on the phone. It's like okay to put it into a holder and use the voice activation and look at it that way, but it said no hands on the phone while you're in the car, even if you're stopped at a light.
Driving.
That would go back to the multiple resource theory thing that I was mentioning earlier. That when you're driving is very much a visual task, but it's also a physical task. So the idea that using a phone is distracting you because you're holding it or manipulating the phone in some way, that idea is it's a little bit off base, because it's not just the physical use of the phone that's distracting you, it's primarily visual. It's taking your vision off of the thing you're supposed to be primarily doing and you're dividing it. Now, if you remember, people only have so much attention to give. If you start dividing it up, you're going to get worse at all the things you're trying to do, right? It's even distracting if people are simply speaking to someone, they're not looking at their phone, but they're having a conversation with someone, and they're not holding it or looking at it, but they're talking to someone. Because the natural give and take and flow of a conversation is disrupted. Yeah.
The young child screams from the back seat.
Yeah.
That was one of the things I got trained to watch for. Car seats.
Yeah.
Distracted driver. Attention.
That's a very distracting one. I think well, many of us, some of you may have had that happen in your own car with young children. And there have been instances too, people are trying to work with the child, reach back, deal with a problem that's happening or something, and go off the road or run them back to someone. I worked an accident like that where someone rear-ended someone because they were dealing with a child. It's easy to say you should pull over and take care of that or don't do it, but we make judgments in those moments about what we think we can handle, and we go ahead and do it. If we think we can handle it, even though we know it's distracting, we'll go ahead and do it. So let's talk a little bit about the environment, what role the environment plays in this stuff. Because I don't want to say too much because it's going to lead us in the direction of road engineering, which is not my specialty, but I do know a little bit about it. I want to touch on education, quickly on human factors, and then some takeaway messages here because we're closing in on the last half hour here. With the environment, I think an important thing to remember is that the environment supports the behavior. If the environment doesn't allow it, it's probably not going to happen, or it'll be very difficult to do it. One of the things we know from road engineering and human behavior, there's some interesting studies out there that show that when people encounter a long, straight stretch of roadway, they are very likely to speed because the road allows it. It gives you a set of affordance, right? You have a long, straight stretch of road. Alternatively, if you have a curve in that road or you have the sides of the road closing in, it becomes more narrow, people will naturally slow down. Right? That's actually, it works, the slowing down works because people are closer to the objects they're passing, and it gives you the sense that you're traveling faster than you really are. People will compensate by slowing down. Some years ago, I did an interview-based study where I was interviewing people about different driving, risk-taking behaviors they engaged in. People kept coming in and talking about driving straight, like driving really fast on this particular stretch of road. And it turned out it was the same place. All of them knew about it. It was up north of Moscow. There was just this spot where the road comes down out of the hills and hits a long, straight, flat stretch. And like I said earlier about the hill and the bicycling behavior, you know, people at the top of that hill, if they're a risk taker, they're more likely to just blast down that hill than if they're not. The same thing, this environmental factor sort of incites this risky behavior. If you engineer roads a certain way, you can actually reduce that just by changing the physical space in some way, because it plays on the cognitive characteristics that people have. But there's a number of things, this is just a short list of things people respond to that can alter behavior. Changing visibility, good signal timing, traffic speed, of course. I like refuge islands a lot, especially for pedestrians, because it gives people a place to go to. If they make a mistake, they've got a place in the middle, right? We find that environment is a very, very powerful predictor of behavior. But we can't accomplish everything by just changing the environment, right? We can get a lot done. One of the things they've done with child pedestrians is creating places like landscaping around schools that diverts the foot traffic away from streets or doesn't allow them to get to it, right? So we don't have to worry about children wandering out there. So if we can't do it all with environmental changes, what can we do with education? We can do a lot. However, education is limited, especially if it's a knowledge-based method. And I'm not saying we should never do knowledge-based education. That's very often the only thing we could do, right? The problem with knowledge-based educational methods for safety is that people know what they're supposed to do, but when they get into the situation where they need to use it, they don't do it for some reason. Either they don't recognize it, they don't generalize what they've learned from a classroom to a real situation, and they fail to recognize when to do that. Or they simply don't do it because they want to do something else. They know what they're supposed to do, but they want to do the thing that's more fun. Like, you're not supposed to speed, but you find that long, straight stretch of highway, and you put the pedal down, right? Because it's going to be fun. So the way I think that we get around that is that we have training methods that, as much as we can do it, is more expensive, but we have training methods that allow people opportunities to practice the behavior during the training, right? Engaging in the behavior as well as knowing what you're supposed to do brings the two things together. It helps solidify it. So for some things though, we're going to have to just have engineering solutions. The things that always come to mind is guardrails. Guardrails are there if you lose control. You don't have to do anything. It's going to keep you on the roadway most of the time. Right? No education is needed for that. It's there in case you have messed up. But I had an engineer tell me one time, this is about 10 years ago, an engineer at ITD who was talking with, and their job was, part of their job was highway design, was determining where turnouts should be, where guardrails should be. And I was like, I was driving down here, passing through Riggins, and there's all these spots where there's just a drop off into the river. Why are there no guardrails there? So, well, there's a formula we use. You know, if it looks like the damage hitting the guardrail is going to be worse than just going off the side, then we don't put a guardrail there. I said, well, what about humans and what people think about that, and the fact that it's terrifying to not have a guardrail? I'd rather hit a guardrail than go 30 feet down to the river. And he said, well, never thought about human behavior being part of it. And I thought, I'm not criticizing this person, I can't even remember who they were. But it was a big shock to me about how we're not coming together, and talking to one another about how we see the same problem. Right? We get entrenched in our ways of doing it. And education is one of those places where we can do a lot, but at a certain point, we're going to have to leave it to design to solve the problem. And that's really where engineering comes in, as a major factor above and beyond all the behavioral safety stuff. There are things that each one of these stakeholders can do that the other ones can't. Engineering can design things in ways that psychologists are not trained or prepared to do, and psychologists can do predictive studies of human behavior in ways that engineers are not trained to do. So we have certain things we do on our own, and we have overlap. So tying this back into human factors very quickly, when we're talking about pedestrians, we could say, well, why did the person make a mistake? That's not a bad question to ask, but it's better to ask, if we want to understand why a person made a mistake, why driving too, driving or pedestrian behaviors. If we want to understand why they made a mistake, we should look at the features of the environment, all the factors together to get a sense of why it happened, not just to place the blame on the environment, road design, or on the individual. Right? We don't want to blame individuals, because it's not entirely the individual's fault. On the other hand, it's also not environmental entirely. Right? We just have to acknowledge there are characteristics in the individual as well as the environment that play a role in unsafe behavior around roadways. So the goal then comes back to being all about designing a transportation system that supports the person who's using it to travel somewhere. Right? We don't want to try to make human behavior correct through training. We want to try to support what the person's natural characteristics and reduce injury that way. We're going to do some takeaway messages, which are very quick, really, just designed for different topics and different types of people who are all attacking the same problem. One of the things I'm very big on is emphasizing to my students and also to my colleagues that we're all working on the same thing. Engineers, psychologists, civil engineers, city planners, epidemiologists, anyone who's studying safety. We're all working on the same thing, and we come at it from different angles, but we have different terminology we use and different concepts and theories, but we're working on the same problems. It's important to work together and to know what the other people are doing. You don't have to be an expert in their area, but have an understanding of what they're doing. So takeaways for designing roads. Design should support the user. Good roadway design supports normal human cognition. Right? It doesn't require people to be perfect, but it also shouldn't introduce any problems like distraction. And a lot of this list of shoulds are basically human factors things, especially when it comes to noticeability, redundancy of cues, simplicity of decision making, all these things that reduce the mental workload. Designing for pedestrians, shorten the crossings, reduce decisions, slow vehicles, right? Traffic calming, better visibility of traffic, but also the pedestrian. And again, good design is going to reduce the cognitive demand that the pedestrian has placed on them by doing their task. But that cognitive demand may be different depending on whether it's a child or an adult or an older adult. And I haven't even touched on biking, or bicyclists, and that's another category too. So finally, just a few recommendations that I've thrown in here for planners, for engineers, for policymakers. We're all bound a little bit. Policymakers in particular, there's only so much money to go around, only certain things can be funded. So sometimes we can't give enough attention to certain things. Yeah, that's all I have for you. And then I'm open to any questions you might have about anything we've discussed. I'm getting done a little bit early, if that's okay. So we've got time for questions.
Any final questions? How do you feel about roundabouts?
I love them. I also think it's funny that so many people are resistant to them. They don't like them. They see them as, some people still see them as this weird European intrusion.
It works.
They do. I live about 100 yards from one. In Moscow, there were 2 roundabouts. And the one, so I've seen some very peculiar things at the one down the street from my house, though. It's a place where we have a long north and south route, the east side of the city, and there was a main route that crossed it, and there was a stop sign there for many years. I think a traffic light might have made some sense too. But they put the roundabout in, and there's still a problem where people who travel north and south still behave as if they have a right of way because they're coming off of a more arterial street. And I see numerous near collisions over there where people who are coming north and south just don't stop. They
So,
just, they
Mountain
don't-
View?
It's
Is it
Mountain
Mountain
View.
View?
Mountain View and 6th Street. Because Mountain View being the north and south, they had no stop sign. So you still see people going in there, just sometimes they bomb right through it, they drive over it. There's enough of an apron there, because large trucks have to go in there, sometimes they need a little bit of room, but some people will just drive right over it. But I think they're great, because it might slow you down a little bit, but it definitely relieved the congestion problem that was there, people having to sit in long lines to get across the street. I mean, the simplicity of it's great.
You just have to pay attention.
If you're in the circle, you have the right of way. If you're not in the circle, you wait till you can get in the circle. That's it. You may have to stop a little bit, but not for too long. And it's only one lane. There's the ones where there's 2 lanes, they get more interesting.
We have a bunch if you want to practice.
I'm okay. I got a little practice this afternoon. You have a question?
Yeah, kind of going back to like driving infrastructure, I've always been pretty curious, and I'm not sure if you would know like the psychology behind it with like yellow lights and the timing of them. I'm from like Portland, and I've noticed because I go back for like family, that like the yellow lights there are shorter, but there's less running of red lights, and then I come here and it's like longer yellow lights, but there's more running of red lights.
That's
Maybe
getting-
different.
It's
but-
getting, you mean using the timing as a sort of a behavioral tool?
Yeah.
People will have an expectancy that the light's gonna be very short, so if they see yellow, they won't try to run it. I don't know enough about that to know if that's actually intentional or if it's just how the lights time. Don't know for sure.
It's intentional.
Is it actually?
Depends on the driver and the area, because Portland, they're used to shorter time frames, and so they don't try to run that yellow, and here it's longer. And it's a safety, a lot of signals have 1 second all red to prevent crashes from occupying the same space, 2 vehicles occupying the same space.
That's interesting. I didn't know that it was intentionally done that way, because I've always assumed that you could set each light up a little bit different.
Yeah, you can,
Yeah.
but it's each jurisdiction has their own control over how that works.
Boise's gotten a little bit better with pedestrian safety. I've noticed that, for instance, when we're waiting at a pedestrian crossing as pedestrians, and the light's red, the traffic alongside of us who might turn across our path, they stay red while our walk sign has come on. So we're already well into the street before they are allowed to make that turn, which helps us, safety wise.
Yeah, you will be seeing more of that.
It's good.
questions? I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes too, if you have something that comes up.
Well, thank you all very much for coming this evening. Thank you, Dr. Barton, for being here. Really appreciate